the recording, I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the Misophonia Professional and Academic Collaboration Workshop number 3. And we're happy today that we can offer continuing education credits for free as a courtesy of site continuinged.com. So thank you to them for doing this service. Official organizers are Jim Claiborne and myself, with, of course, the site Continuing Education. For attending today, you get two continuing education credits that are from an APA-approved provider. So if you need something other than APA-approved continuing education credits, there are not a lot of other approvals for this provider. So our learning objectives for today, listed these for the continuing education credit. One is to identify the common EEG patterns for individuals with misophonia, and Randy Lyle is going to talk about that. And then also to identify the duration and treatment for the individuals that Randy has treated who have had reported improvement, and those who have not, using biofeedback. And then from Chris's presentation, we hope that you'll be able to identify the components of misophonia that are altered by sequent repatterning, and also identify the level of empirical support for sequent repatterning and the risk of harm with this treatment. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and start with Dr. Randy Lyle's presentation, Misophonia Searching for a Treatment. Randy is an associate professor and in Marriage and Family Therapy program at St. Mercy University in Iowa. He has his own practice and has been using neurofeedback for almost 20 years now as part of that practice. And so, Randy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you at this time.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. And hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all and talk a little bit about misophonia and neurofeedback. As Tom mentioned, I've been at Mount Mercy University for about 6 years now. Prior to that, I was a program director of a marriage and family therapy program, both doctoral and master's program in San Antonio, Texas. While there, I created a subspecialty for training students to provide neurofeedback services, and we created a clinic out of the university. So I've been doing neurofeedback and teaching it for a fairly long time now. I guess it's been about 4 or 5 years ago now. Shortly after I moved to Cedar Rapids, I had a fellow come in for therapy. Specifically, he wanted to try neurofeedback. His initial complaint was that he had a touch of what he described as OCD. And he thought that his son probably suffered from it as well. And so he was going to test it out on himself and see if neurofeedback would offer anything. And if yes, then he was going to invite his son to take part in it as well. Well, as we got going and got to know one another, it turns out that what he was in fact experiencing wasn't simply OCD, he was experiencing misophonia. And as we get into the case studies, we'll see that he is one of the case studies, and in fact my first and most successful case. His son also suffered from it, and I also trained him for misophonia, and that set me on a journey that lands me here with you all. Little did I know that I was going to end up being one of the foremost experts on the use of neurofeedback and misophonia in the United States a few years later, which is not to say that I'm any kind of expert at all. It just says that I'm one of the few people who's been doing it for a while. The slides represent a study that I've completed enough to write a paper and submit it for publication. I presented it at ISNR, which stands for the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research. this past year. We've opened the door by getting the word about misophonia out into the neurofeedback community. They have a meeting once a year. There's usually between 600 and 700 people there attending. They range from MDs, neurologists, to therapists, psychologists, a whole wide variety of people who are, for the most part, interested in or doing neurofeedback. The presentation was well received with lots and lots of questions. Lots of people coming up to me after the presentation and saying, "Oh, yes, I'm treating people. I have people who have been coming to me with those issues, and now I know more of what it is and what to do about it." The year before, Miriam Edelstein, and if any of you have read the literature, know that she's one of the first people to really look at it from a neurological perspective. She works at V.S. Ramachandran's clinic out in San Diego, which I think is extraordinarily exciting for the misophonia community, because Ramachandran is probably one of the foremost neurologists in the world. And if his clinic has become interested in something, that means that he can generate some income and some excellent research. So I'm optimistic that we may find out some new and interesting things here in the future. To just kind of briefly go over the study, give you some ideas about what it is and what we did. Quantitative research is the research that most of us are familiar with. It's putting numbers to things, operationalizing the data, limiting all of the confounds and all of that. So it's the stuff that we're most familiar with. Qualitative research, which is actually my preference and what I do the most, is actually talking to people with, or people who have or are interested in the phenomenon that we're seeking to understand better. In this case, we did a combined methods study. So we looked for quantitative data by recording the quantitative EEG of the 3 people that are reported in this study. I then got additional EEGs from around the United States for other folks who suffer with misophonia but weren't in my practice. The qualitative component is sitting down and talking with 3 of those people that I've treated here and asking them to describe what was your symptomology, what was your experience of neurofeedback, how did it help, what was the process like, and we'll look at that a little bit as we go along here. We probably are still in the process of trying to define misophonia. These are a couple of definitions that have been offered, one of them from Edelstein, who I was just talking about a minute ago. Again, Edelstein's study was one of first sitting down and talking to people and asking them to describe what misophonia is. From those descriptions, a common definition for misophonia is, as she says, a quote, "a strong dislike of certain sounds and an abnormally strong reaction to them, such as anger or even fear." I'm imagining that several of our participants that are listening today are people who suffer with misophonia, so you probably have your own definitions that you can give to that in much more detail. As we've learned more about it, going around listening to people and having people call me up to say, "I'm treating somebody with neurofeedback with misophonia, can you help?" It is much like a spectrum disorder, kind of like autism or others. You can have a little bit of misophonia or you can have a lot, it seems. So you can have some people who experience it, they find it frustrating and challenging, but they're able to go about their daily lives without too much effort. They find ways of coping with it. And then you have people who, in fact, are not leaving the house at all, or even worse, have attempted or completed suicide because the problem is just the response is just too much, and they just simply are not able to do it. This particular slide talks about that as we've examined misophonia as it's sort of become known, we find that because of those responses, it's received a variety of definitions and descriptions, ranging from OCD or PTSD, social phobia, intermittent explosive disorder, etc. That's still very much the case. If you go to a psychologist or others who are not familiar with misophonia, you stand a very high likelihood of having a misdiagnosis where you will be described as having one of those disorders, and then being recommended treatment for those disorders, which more often than not is going to be medication. Medication is not proven to be useful except for some moderation of some symptomology, but even that not particularly grateful or great as so far as people have reported to me anyway. Coherence is one of the measures that we looked at as we recorded the EEG. I should probably say something here about what quantitative EEG is, or QEEG as it's called briefly. QEEG is doing what would be a typical clinical EEG, just like you would get at the neurologist's office if you had a car accident or you were experiencing the symptomology of seizures or some other reason for them to look at what's going on in the electrical activity in your brain. We put 19 electrodes on the head, and we measure all of the electrical activity from those 19 locations in real time. We usually do it in two different conditions, one with eyes closed, the other eyes open, because our brains may work differently between the eyes open and the eyes closed. We then take that information, we clean it up, and we don't look for the same kinds of things that the neurologist would look for, spike and wave activity indicative of epilepsy or other things. Rather, we clean it all up and get rid of any of those if they are there. We then compare that to a norm database. So we have several thousand carefully recorded EEGs from people who were carefully screened to make sure that there was no brain disorder of any sort. And then compare that individual's recorded EEG to that norm database. And that then tells us in 4 different domains what is normal, that is, say what falls within a statistical norm, and what is not normal, what is outside of those statistical norms. One of the domains in which we are able to look at that normed or not normed is coherence. I describe coherence as your brain talking from one region to another region. So the front of the brain talking to the back of the brain, or the right side talking to the left side. And if we think of that in analogical terms as sort of a telephone call, coherence can be the telephone call normally would go right through wherever you're talking to that other part of the brain in order to complete your connection and be able to do what you want your brain to do. That's how it should work. Sometimes in hypercoherence, the message is getting through so fast that it's garbled and the connection doesn't really get made. At other times, in hypocoherence, it takes so long for the message to get to the other connection that by the time it gets there, they've already hung up. They don't want to listen to you. So hypo or hypercoherence means that the brain cannot, in fact, do what it needs to do because it cannot communicate to the different regions, which is indeed how the brain works. So this simply explains that, with coherence, we did the measurements as we would. We explained all of the details of that. We took all of that recorded information. We cleaned it all up. We ran it through the database and compared it. We used the NeuroRep software to look at a multivariate coherence analysis system rather than a simple ANOVA, or a very simple basic comparison. This was a more complex and more in-depth way of examining the coherence measures. This would be the kind of map that you would get. This indeed is the overarching map. When you put all of the EEGs that we evaluated together, you get this sort of map. And if you imagine, if you can put the brain or a skull around these top ones, the horizontal, sagittal, and coronal, then you're looking at how at all of these electrode sites the brain is connected. The more closely packed together they are, you have hypercoherence. The more distant they are from one another, the more you have hypercoherence. So we can see then in general terms that there are some discrepancies here. There are some areas of the brain that are quite closely packed. Some regions, in fact, just kind of disappear. You can't even see them. They're so closely packed together. that tells us that there's some dysfunction going on there. There's some hypercoherence going on. The lower heads are then the exact numbers that are measured in that, which are relative to the software. So this map simply indicates for us that globally, yes, we have some indications that coherence is at least nominally involved in brains that experience misophonia, that it's not working quite right. Now, that does not give us causality. We don't know that that's the cause of the misophonia symptom, but we at least know that there tends to be some dysfunctions in the measurement of how well the brain is communicating across different regions. These particular ones resulted from 5 records that were from my practice and 4 additional records from other providers around the country. So we had a total of 9 EEGs that we fed into the comparison. We visually compared all of the different coherence steps for all 9 subjects. There was no common pattern. So there was, they weren't all the right side of the head talking to the left front part of the head or something like that. There was no clear pattern of commonality across those measures. What we can say, as I just pointed out on the previous map, we can say that there is a tendency for all of those brains to have problems with coherence. We just simply didn't find that they all had the same problem in the same region. My interpretation of that for our purposes is to say that, as we know, misophonia operates on a spectrum. It is not a singular brain problem. That is to say, it's not like, oh, it's always going to be related to this region of the brain in this particular domain, but rather different regions of the brain are going to be differently affected, and that's going to be probably be reflected in how people experience the symptoms. More severe, less severe, what kinds of sounds are more problematical for them, those sorts of things. Now, the second measure that we looked at in order to try and get our quantitative data is something called LORETA. LORETA stands for Low Resonance Electrotomographic Analysis. It is a technique that was developed over many, many years and much effort by an Italian physicist. And what it allows us to do is to record the activity of the brain at the surface and through mathematical transformations discern from that information where inside of the brain signal problems are arising. This was a great, huge step forward for us in terms of understanding and treating with neurofeedback brain disorders. Prior to the integration of LORETA into neurofeedback, all we could do was really train the strength or the type of signal at the surface. We really had no idea what was happening below the surface of the brain, nor how we were affecting it. We now can find out, oh, this signal is coming from somewhere in the subcortical structure, and we can continue to record and analyze that data and say, oh, we've done something to that, and it was something we wanted to do. So that's been a great stride forward for the neurofeedback community. This is a whole lot of information that's probably really, really important for peer-reviewed journals and scientists. If there are any of that, you can read it at your leisure and certainly send me an email or whatever to ask me more details. For most folks, it's not really all that interesting. I'm not going to go over it except to say it's here and you can look at it and look into it in more detail. Again, this is more specific detail about how EEG, how the LORETA works. I don't think you want to know about that. These are the details in terms of the statistics that we ran. Again, really important for the scientific community, not particularly important for consumers. And it just says, you know, should someone want to replicate what we did, these would be the things that would be important to continue in this study. This is an overall map reflecting the results of all of the studies, all of the EEGs that we combined in order to look at in generic terms across the board, do we see anything significant? What we discover here, and we'll talk about it in more detail here in a second, is that indeed here the red and the yellow reflects some excess activity in these particular regions. So this is a model of the brain. We see this is the back side, so back here in the parietal and somewhat to the occipital regions, we see an excess of activity, specifically at this frequency 8 hertz or in the alpha frequency. We also see there's some excessive activity along the midline towards the frontal part of the brain, and a little bit on the sensory motor strip. And then we can see this from all the different angles, right, left side, looking from the top, looking from the back, in order to localize that to the brain. We see, again, the same thing reported, but now we're looking at 6 hertz. And so we can see that there's, again, some activity, particularly in the right occipital and parietal regions, up here on the parietal regions, this region, here on the right side, here left frontal. So we get some idea that, yes, from a LORETA perspective, there does seem to be some presentation of dysregulation. That is to say, there are areas of all of these brains that seem to be out of the norm, outside of the norm, statistically outside of the norm. And then we look at those specific regions and say, do those make any sense in terms of the symptomology related to what is reported with misophonia? And so here we see that the compiled files and eyes closed both all showed slower frequencies in delta and theta, that is to say the slower waves, and beta frequencies in the parietal cortex, so towards the back. Parietal cortex is all about our sense of our body internally and externally. That is to say that I have a body, I'm aware of it, I know how it works, and I'm aware that I have a body and it's in relationship to other bodies. That information is all being processed in the parietal cortex, and then of course all of the other environmental data that's coming in. So we would say that probably makes some degree of sense, that the parietal cortex would be having some challenges and not be working appropriately would make sense to us in terms of the symptomology commonly associated with misophonia. And that maximal localization is in Brodmann area 7 and in delta, specifically in delta and theta. Here, as we say, Brodmann area 7 is involved in the visual motor coordination and contributes to the variety of high-level processing tasks, including activation and association with language use. Only with eyes closed condition did we notice that the alpha band is focal in the medial frontal gyrus of the frontal lobe, specifically Brodmann area 9, which is involved in short-term memory, error detection, sustained attention, auditory verbal attention, and other executive functions. So again, does that make sense to us in terms of the presentation of most misophonia symptoms? We can at least somewhat say, yes, that makes sense, particularly executive function. I hear a noise, I recognize what that noise is, I perhaps see it. What should I do about it? Well, if somebody's chewing their food across the table from me, I should probably ignore it. At worst, say, close your mouth, you're chewing too loudly, particularly if it's one of my children. Instead, I go into a rage. So there's clearly a problem. I have some auditory functioning going on, but I don't seem to be able to discern the appropriate action or control that. So LORETA tells us that at least tentatively, there is some reason to suspect that brain function, particularly at a sort of subcortical level, is related in some form or another to the experience of misophonia's symptomology. So again, the summary of the quantitative part of the study is that we got some anomalies, we got some ideas that there were some potential problems in these brains. We did not find anything that was consistent that each individual, all of those 10 EEGs had. So yes, they all had something. No, it wasn't always the same thing, but there was some inclusion in certain regions, which we just talked about. Qualitative study, this is kind of more interesting to me because as a therapist, I'm more interested in people than I am in numbers. So the study looked at specifically 3 people that were willing to participate in the study, 2 males, 1 female. The female is 13 years of age. The 2 males were both in their mid-60s. All three of them received a combination of traditional neurofeedback, which is to say we trained specifically amplitude and frequency in just a single region of the brain with just one or two wires as a general rule. Sometimes we do 4-channel and move it up, have 8 wires on there. And the Z-score LORETA feedback, which is doing all 19 channels simultaneously and training all of the different domains. Through subjects is subject 1. She's 13 years old, female, or she was at the time of the study. Onset was at age 9. Her major triggers were gum chewing, eating, especially with her father and brother. Repetitive sounds like pen clicking or tapping. She ultimately required homeschooling because the triggers were too severe at school, and she could not eat with the family due to the rages, particularly with her father. At the time of the interview, she'd received 80 sessions of neurofeedback. When we asked her on a scale of 1 to 10, comparing her symptoms at the beginning and where she was now, 1 being totally cured, not bothered by the symptoms, she said that at her worst trigger, gum chewing, she would currently be at a 5. When asked if this 5 was livable when she hears people chewing gum or chips, she said, "It is better, but I still hate it." With all other triggers, like her brother's eating, she claims it is now a 2. However, both she and her mother were quick to clarify that these numbers were dependent on her getting enough sleep, how well she's been eating, and how she feels towards the person. She was still struggling with her father. She's actually just returned to treatment last week. We're just about to finish with school, so the plan all along was for her to come back during the summer and do some more treatment. She still finds her dad's eating to be her major trigger, and is still struggling with that a bit, but she is in school, attends school full time, is able to participate fully in those activities. Subject 2, 60-year-old male, onset, as he recalls, around 6, comorbid with OCD, that is to say he also experienced obsessive compulsive disorder. Triggers were gum chewing, lip smacking, loud eating. Triggers for both auditory and visual. He organized his life around the possibility of being triggered, always said at a public occasion so he could escape. Used alcohol for self-soothing, something that we hear about a lot in the area if it's an adult. His wife carefully managed the house activities to try and keep the triggers at bay, and son also suffers from misophonia. While the son did not participate in the study, I did also treat him with neurofeedback and should say something about that. This is the person that I mentioned initially that got me involved in misophonia. He had a total of 240 sessions. He attributed this large number of sessions to his strain of OCD and being a perfectionist. At the end of the day, he just wanted it to be completely gone, so I went to a lot of sessions. According to his report, he said he needed at least the first 160. But when he asked if he felt like he needed this many sessions, he said that he saw some incremental improvement from 160 to 200 and from 200 to 240. He now believes that he is 97% cured. The last 3% is basically just his fear that it might come back. It's not that he actually experiences any challenges with it. Gum chewing is no longer a problem for him. And as he said, life is 100,000% better. He also says that he felt some initial results after the first 11 sessions. Part of the clarification with this particular client is that when I started seeing him, I was not doing the LORETA Z-score neurofeedback. I didn't have that available to me. As we continued with his treatment, after about a year of treatment was when I got the LORETA Z-score and began that treatment with him. I think we saw another jump in improvement in his case. I've found that traditional neurofeedback isn't always helpful, and when it is, even if it is, it's a lot slower than the LORETA is. Treatment with his son, who's not, as I noted, is not included in this study. We also had good success with him. He has now gone off and is in college. We did not have as good a success with him as we had with the father. The father still remains my most successful case, where basically he's cured. Son himself rated himself as having between a 75 and 80% improvement in symptomology. Can pretty much do anything. As I said, he's at college full-time, very successful in school, not having any problems in that. Still has triggers, notices them, but just isn't as bothered by them. So he's kind of gone from one of those folks who can't leave the house to being one of those folks who can pretty well manage his life without too much difficulty. Just gets annoyed and frustrated fairly frequently. Subject 3, also a male in his mid-60s. He remembers onset at about age 15 or 16. Primary symptomology was chewing, lip smacking, throat clearing, coughing, loud noises, repetitive noises like pen clipping or tapping, bothered by both auditory and visual triggers. His misophonia has increased and worsened as time has gone on. 4 marriages ended due to misophonia by his measure, as well as numerous jobs. The last 2 both became self-employed so that they could have more control over their lives in order to manage the misophonia to a large degree. This individual has seen many neurofeedback practitioners and done a whole lot of other things with me. We kind of threw the kitchen sink at him. At the time of this study, we were kind of at the beginning stages of his working with me. We hadn't seen any improvement. And in fact, after a lot of treatment, he never did see any significant improvement in the symptomology related to misophonia. That being said, he did see a lot of improvement in his ability to cope with it, his ability to manage his symptomology was improved, and I think his sense of his quality of life was improved, although we hadn't really done much of anything for the misophonia. So he is my major failure. We continue to hope that we can find a pathway to helping him have some relief of symptomology. So all of the clients received a combination of the LORETA 19-channel Z-score training and 1 or 2-channel amplitude training. All of these were guided by the quantitative EEG. So we did the quantitative EEG beginning and then regularly repeated it. All of them participated in passive infrared hemoencephalography training, that's PIR-HEG. That is a method of training that was originally designed to treat migraine headaches. It involves shining a specific frequency of infrared light onto the forehead, measuring the change fluctuations in temperature as a result of participating in the training, and rewarding the brain when it's able to activate the frontal lobes of the brain. My rationale for that is that executive function seems to be a consistent issue for folks with misophonia. Executive function would, of course, be my ability to say there's no reason for me to be upset by this, and therefore not be. So I hypothesized that additional training of a variety of sorts of the frontal lobes, which is where the executive control exists or resides for the most part, might facilitate improvement. PIR also requires a whole brain participation, so I was hoping it would be integrative of the other forms of training. I would say the jury's still out on that. I haven't run any numbers on it or consistently integrated it in such a way that I can easily study that. So I'd say the jury is still out. Since we did this additional, when I did this original collection of data, I've had 2 more misophonia clients, and the 13-year-old that I talked about has returned to training. They've all reported continued improvement. The other 2 teenage girls, both of them, because by now I have a kind of pattern that I follow, seem to respond more quickly. They all felt that they made significant improvements, and in fact, one completed 60 sessions and is now taking a break from treatment, may or may not come back. The other one reports a 70% improvement, again, is now taking a break and may or may not come back. Their plan was to return, but I'm not sure. I haven't heard from them, so I can't say. So conclusions regarding the study is, as I said, misophonia appears to be a spectrum disorder. It can range from mild to severe. There are a variety of means by which people try to cope with it. For those of you who are suffering and listening to this, or will listen to this, you all know that. You find ways, or you seek to find ways. I would say that neurofeedback is a viable treatment. It is not universally helpful, but then nothing is for anything as near as I can tell. But it does seem to be useful for a great number of people. It doesn't necessarily cure. In fact, that seems to be fairly rare, but it does make it a lot better and moderates it. And so far, many people are able to report that their daily living is improved. Probably subcortical. You find that in the LORETA findings. May be related to coherence as well, but it's also clearly multidimensional. That is to say, it's in a variety of regions of the brain in a variety of networks and connections. So far there is no magic bullet or single treatment that will get us to where we want to be. That's probably good. You can read the rest of those. Oh, I will mention the neurofield treatment. If you're on any of the listservs, you will have heard Jamie Moore's name being mentioned frequently in the last few months. Jamie is a registered nurse working out of Omaha, Nebraska. Does do neurofeedback, but also primarily works with neurofield. Neurofield is known as a pulsed electromagnetic field therapy. It pulses tiny amounts of electromagnetic energy. Can be placed on the body or on the head. He's doing a lot of work that's oriented towards physiological issues such as diet, inflammation, those sorts of things, which he's also reporting some good outcomes. There's a couple of people on the Misophonia listserv who are keeping us informed as their children go through the process, and they are experiencing some significant progress as well. I've since integrated neurofield into what I do as well, and I'm hoping to have the opportunity to find out if I get the same sort of increase in benefit by having all of those different modalities available to me. I've got some questions over here I see on my screen. What is the duration of a single therapeutic session, and how frequently do individuals attend for therapy is one question. Duration of a single therapeutic session is about between 35 and 45 minutes as a general rule. I generally encourage folks to attend at least twice a week. At the beginning of treatment, my hunch is with misophonia, if we could get them in more often for a more intensive beginning, every day, for example, for a couple, 3 weeks, we probably could push things towards improvement a little bit faster. Twice a week works. One of my favorite sayings is there's the ideal and then there's what we can do. So for a whole lot of folks, including me, since I have my practice is actually a part-time deal and this is not my full-time job, that's the scheduling of somebody every day is a challenge. As I reported with these three, about 5 out of the three that I talked, or the 3 out of the 5 that I talked about have all had improvements. Twice a week will work. Have there been any studies using attentional training, mindfulness as a component of the treatment? I'm not aware of any studies out there. I do talk to all of my clients about mindfulness. I also encourage all of them to take fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids. And I've been increasingly encouraging them to take probiotics as well. Recent research has been clearly making a strong connection that the blood-brain, the gut-brain connection is critical for our well-being and for the well-being functioning of our brain. So increasingly, we're looking at ways to treat inflammation, and neurofield can give us a real hands up on that. So we're integrating that. Mindfulness as a means of helping you to cope has proven, I think, is very useful for the clients that's had no success with the symptomology of misophonia by itself. Getting him to do meditation training, and he in fact went and did some intensive training for meditation, has helped him immensely. Curious if there is any evidence of activity in the insular cortex being implicated in misophonia. It has shown up with the various clients and other EEGs that I have evaluated, but not universally. So again, sometimes indeed, yes, it shows up as being an area that is not functioning as it should in the electrical domain. But again, it's not consistent. It is not in every client that we have seen with misophonia.
Randy, there is a question by Sukhvinder Kumar about, that maybe was rolled off your screen, about the variable that you're trying to control with the neurofeedback sessions, power, coherence. What is it that you're trying to have them work and control?
When we do the LORETA Z-score training, we are training all four of the major domains. So we're training to affect amplitude, frequency, coherence, and phase. Phase is the means, if you think of Morse code, how one region of the brain tells the other brain what to do is in how it pulses, the speed with which it pulses the electrical signal. That's the measure of phase. So coherence is the measure of the communication between the two. Phase is its ability to do that and say what it needs to say. So we train all four of those domains simultaneously across all 19 channels in whatever regions we've highlighted in the software. When we do the traditional neurofeedback, we're primarily just interested in frequency and amplitude. So when we're doing the traditional neurofeedback, those are the two domains that we're training. Again, each of those is trained in whatever it is we need to train is in response to what the quantitative EEG has told us is not functioning correctly. That is to say, there's 2 or more standard deviations outside of the norm.
Okay, so we have a request to hear from Sukhvinder Kumar. Sukhvinder, I just clicked your microphone.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me now better?
It sounds like your microphone is too sensitive, and it would probably help if you had.
Okay, that's fine, yeah. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, actually. Just a couple of questions, specific questions. So one thing that I didn't get was when you are trying to find out the unique pattern, did you compare it to control subjects?
No, we didn't have any control.
Like I said, Sukhvinder, you're still way too loud and you're distorting. So Randy, did you get enough there to answer that first question before I cut him off?
Yeah, I've got at least part of it.
Okay, go ahead, and I'm gonna, because we're getting feedback from Sukhvinder's speakers and microphones, so I'll have to have him cut off when anyone else is speaking. Go ahead, Randy.
Okay. We didn't have any controls to the study. As I noted, this was a pilot study, limited in its scope. Within the quantitative EEG, so when we're specifically training the regions in an individual, we have taken his or her EEG, compared it to a norm database, and then we are training that towards that norm. So each individual is being trained against a control, as it were, but there's no global control for the study. So that, right now, just trying to figure out, can we nail down what regions of the brain or what domains within brain function are responsible for this, or most commonly responsible, would then give us a means to begin to refine and operationalize things sufficiently to do controls. I don't think we have enough information yet to be able to actually do that.
Okay. Okay.
The other, in the neurofeedback, are they trying to? Sorry, I didn't understand that completely. Are they trying to reduce the alpha? Are you just concentrating on the alpha power coherence, and are they trying to increase alpha power, or are they trying to decrease alpha power?
That will depend on what their quantitative EEG revealed. If they are so the treatment is customized to each individual. So if they have an increase of alpha, that's what shows up as being 2 or more standard deviations outside of the norm, then we will train them to, I forgot which I said. If it's too low, we'll train them to increase it. If it's too high, we'll train them to decrease it. Same with all of the other measures. So if the quantitative EEG for that individual says that you're experiencing hypercoherence between the front and the back of the brain in certain specific regions, then we will set the program to encourage you to reduce that hypercoherence. So each individual has a customized treatment to the specificity of what we discovered is being problematical with their individual brain. That answer your question?
So Dr. Bender talked very, very quietly. You have the microphone.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So how many do you think out of 9 subjects had hypo power in the alpha band, and how many of them had hyper alpha power or coherence? Do you have some statistics related to that?
I can't really break that down off the top of my head by individuals. What we saw in the overall findings of LORETA was that if I don't remember, I can go back here and look. So in eyes closed, resting condition only, the alpha band is focal in the medial frontal gyrus of the frontal lobe, specifically Brodmann area 9. And theta, and that only occurred in the eyes closed condition. Theta and delta were the 2 areas that were most, were the 2 frequencies that were most involved in the eyes, and both eyes closed and eyes open conditioning across those 10 EEGs. But I can't tell you how many of those individuals experienced either of those. That, these are just the summative numbers of that.
Okay, before I give the microphone back to Dr. Bender again, if anybody else would like to ask a question, to speak up, there's a little hand sign up at the top of your screen somewhere that it's a raise my hand with, with something like this. And so just click that and I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you very much. Just the last question. Sorry for asking too many questions, but because it's very interesting to me, and it's a very interesting data set actually. So regarding the coherence, do you think? Sorry, probably I missed that slide. Maybe it went a bit quickly. Was the coherence higher coherence between the frontal and the kind of occipital part of the brain, that was higher coherence in the misophonia, or it was the less coherence? Can you just maybe take through that slide again, if possible, please?
Right. But here's the global map. The conclusions from that are that the visual comparison of the coherence maps for all 9 subjects revealed no common pattern of hyper or hypocoherent, which is to say that some were hypercoherent, some were hypocoherent. There was not a consistent, there was not a sufficient number of those for us to say that, yes, it's a hyper or a hypo problem. We are beginning to get a good enough trend to be able to say that, however, if there is probably a component of misophonia that is related to coherence.
And I just want to remind everyone that the presentations are uploaded to Google Drive. I'll be sending out it's the same link as for workshop 2. And so I'll send that again out as a reminder. We have a couple more questions down here. Randy, you want to address Esther's questions?
Yeah, the one at the bottom I see, which is, do I have the references or studies or a set of abstracts you could email us, specifically related to the use of neurofeedback with misophonia. This is the only study that exists to the best of my knowledge. The other specific neurological references to misophonia are in the paper, on the slide. So if you look at the last slide where the references are, those are the ones that we can find that are related specifically to neurological seekings after. Tom's got some articles that he's posted that are in other domains that I'm not talking about here. And do I have a list of neurofeedback or LORETA providers? How accessible is the treatment for sufferers? You can go to a couple of different locations. One would be bcia.org. That's the Biofeedback Certification International Alliance. They provide the certification for practitioners who seek to be certified. They have a list of providers by zip code, state and or country to the degree that people have given us that information. And they're broken down by both biofeedback, traditional biofeedback, and neurofeedback. And ISNR, International Society for Neurofeedback and Research, .org, also, which is the National Organization for Neurofeedback Providers. They also have a members list that you can look at and search it by state, country, or zip code. Finding someone who has and does the LORETA Z-score training is more challenging than just finding traditional training. There's fewer of us out there doing that. And depending on where you are in the country, it can be either very easy to find a practitioner or very challenging. There's 6 providers in the state of Iowa, and as far as I know, I'm the only one who has trained misophonia. But if you get out to the east or the west coast, you can find a lot of providers.
Okay, so this is a collaboration workshop. If anyone has a discussion point you want to bring up, I'm going to bring one up, so I'm going to just mention that, and then please step in, express opinions and views of what you see and what you think. But, you know, Randy, one of the things that I noted in the 9-year-old girl is that she was much better. I mean, obviously there's been a drastic improvement and a benefit to her life, but that mom still mentioned that for her to be doing well, she has to be getting enough sleep and eating and have a general cooperative relationship with whoever it is that's the trigger person, right? Which implies that they're, I'm going to just suggest that to me, one potential benefit of neurofeedback is that it improves the overall health and well-being of individuals, right? That it improves sleep. It improves. Can it also improve mood? I'm not sure if it improves mood. But it does have global benefits, does it not?
Yes, indeed, exactly.
Right, and so with the people that I've worked with, almost universally, they will say that when they are feeling better, their misophonia is less severe. So that there's a direct correlation inverse correlation between wellness and well-being and misophonia severity. So it seems like there could also be an indirect, very positive effect of neurofeedback just by working on health and well-being, which may also be what Jamie Moore is seeing when he's working on the, diet and inflammation and other things that affect wellness. What do you think about that?
To a certain degree, I totally agree. All of us with whatever things we have, as our personal, gee, I have this challenge or that challenge. If we're rested, we've been eating well, we're generally healthy and taking care of ourselves, we cope better. than when we're not. And clearly we know from his long, 50 plus years of doing neurofeedback, we know that we help that for people. We help people just generally manage better. Also, when I'm doing therapy, neurotherapy, it's a one-on-one deal. I'm also talking to them. I also am coaching them in terms of ways to manage stress better, et cetera. That being said, what the study shows is that, well, indeed, we did find that the EEG changes. And I didn't put any of that information up there, but we record cues all the way along. So I have what your brain looked like and how it was functioning in the electronic area from the day that you walked in, and then I have it again from the last day you see me. And so we can show that we, in fact, have changed the EEG, that they don't have the same brain leaving that they had coming in. And we can associate those changes with the kinds of regions in the brain that the symptomology is associated with. So executive control has improved. The auditory circuits are functioning better. The abnormalities that we saw in the parietal or the occipital lobe are lessened or have changed. So I think the answer is both and yes. Yes, we help them just manage better, and yes, we're also changing the brain, which I think is responsible for, in many cases, for the diminution of the symptomology.
In the individual that did not respond with reduced misophonia symptoms, did his brain also change?
We saw changes in his EEG. Particular individual is complicated.
Yes. And those of us who are involved in treatment of people with misophonia know that this person's case is complicated.
And so it isn't my hypothesis for why we did not ultimately get the changes that we anticipated, specifically the misophonia, is some other conditions that pre-existed that we were working on. I mean, I think we made some progress in there, and I think his overall life function is improved in part because we were able to do that. He's a complicated case.
He's a complicated case. There was a question about mindfulness being incorporated. I have found that progressive muscle relaxation is particularly beneficial for individuals with misophonia because it develops the neurological connections to willfully relax muscles in your body, and that whenever a person is tense or triggered or stressed, to be able to relax, for them to be able to relax their muscles has a positive effect on their misophonia. And so I personally would recommend progressive muscle relaxation because it produces essentially an equal level of overall relaxation and stress reduction, but it also builds the skill to be able for the person to just go relax and just relax the muscles in their body, and I find that it's a good component to any kind of treatment.
I'd agree with you 100%, Tom.
Okay. Other questions? We're out of time here, but do we have a last question or so? Otherwise, we will say, Randy, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, great information. We just need to know more, right?
We got to keep searching.
We need more. So, okay. So thank you, Randy, and would like to introduce Chris Pearson. Chris, whose camera is offline. Whew! Had me worried there, Chris. Had me worried. Looked like you combed your hair again. So, anyway, just going. Chris is going to be presenting on Sequent Repatterning Hypnotherapy, an effective treatment for misophonia. And Chris is a accredited senior hypnotherapist, proficient in NLP and parts therapy and timeline therapy. And in fact, I'll let you briefly tell your story as to how you got involved in misophonia. Maybe that's part of your presentation, so I won't go into that. But Chris and I met up, was that at the end of 2014, I think, that was looking up. I actually saw one of Chris's videos on YouTube and sent him an email because he was looking at some of the components of misophonia that I was interested in. And we have a great working relationship. So, Chris, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay just before
Yeah, you're great. Your audio is terrific.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Chris Pearson, as introduced by Tom. And really this presentation is to introduce a feasible treatment for misophonia, and that's Sequent Repatterning. And it will include, first of all, a brief introduction to me, and then a quick view of the model of misophonia that I recognise. Now we can then review what constitutes the condition and the aspects of the condition that we can move on to treat. That in turn can inform our approach to therapy, I think. So from there we can take a look at Sequent Repatterning, which is the name that we've given to this group of interventions, just looking at the concepts and the structure rather than the detail of each therapeutic intervention. And then we can review its effectiveness, and to do that I'm going to introduce some basic data on cases that were begun and completed during 2015, their outcomes in fact. So being that these occurred during 2015, we've been able to take some medium-term feedback from the clients who were treated during that time. And then finally, I'd like to look forward with a few slides on our future plans. Now, I think as Tom has said, the plan is to complete this presentation to allow about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So as I endeavour to make this work, as I've said, I am Chris Pearson. There's a picture of me if you can't see my video. I have a practice within the John Cox Health and Physiotherapy practice, which is in Yorkshire in the northeast of England. Quite obviously misophonia is being treated internationally now. I began my day 13 hours ago with a session with someone in Canberra in Australia, and during the day I've gradually covered most of the world, I think, ending at about 2 hours ago in the USA. I've had therapy rooms here in Yorkshire for almost 7 years now. It's over 5 years since I first encountered misophonia in a client, and I guess this is probably the 4th year of applying the techniques that make Sequent Repatterning. I first came across misophonia when someone came to me and told me that they had to wear earplugs while they were eating their meals with their partner. I confess I didn't really know what it was that was wrong with them. I did my best. Since then, working as a supervisor of other therapists in this part of the world, I came across other therapists who had also encountered individuals with what we now know to be misophonia. And so it very soon became clear that we needed to develop some kind of therapy that was effective. And as Tom said, we came across one another probably just over 2 years ago now, but since then we've been able to develop a close working relationship and also help, I think, a number of individuals. And in that time, I've seen, and I hope I've helped, men, women and boys and girls with misophonia in about 150 cases now, as well as introducing 3 other therapists to these techniques, and they all now have cases of their own. I'd like to say that I think of myself as a scientist. I began my life as a clinical biochemist, and although that was a long time ago, I do appreciate scientific rigour, and I hope that my therapies reflect that. So I must begin by saying clearly that my appreciation of the condition called misophonia is not one of selective sound sensitivity. I don't consider it to be purely a disorder of the auditory physiology. I've become increasingly aware, working with individuals with misophonia, that what elicits a misophonia response is quite definitely a sensory experience. And it may be predominantly in the auditory domain, but certainly not exclusively. And I've seen clients with a mixture of auditory and visual. I've treated one client who had exclusively a kinesthetic condition. So I think it needs to be emphasised that we are dealing with something which is multisensory. Also, I consider the initiating sensory event to be an experience, and certainly with clients I avoid the use of the word trigger, because I think that trigger implies an inevitability that is not absolute in the real world. I think we need to ensure that clients don't think of this as being something which is entirely outside of their control. The conditioned response that we mention in the list on the slide, well, misophonia is a learned, acquired condition, and it's something which is conditioned, and it includes a reflex. And I think probably Tom has spoken on that topic quite extensively. But it is consolidated in neural networks, the neural networks of the brain, and becomes a pattern of behaviour that for an individual seems unavoidable. But certainly I think that there are options to begin to demonstrate to the client, even before we begin with therapy, that these things are not unavoidable. So the model of misophonia is one of 5 components. I consider that it very much consists of 3 elements, which are the sensory start to the process. There's a physical reflex, or the reflex action, and there's an emotional response. And that emotional response is one that varies. It can be rage, anger, it can be shame, it can be guilt. There are so many emotions. And the other 2 components that we need to look at are these, that are linkages. And these I believe to be the neural patterns that are created as the condition is learned. So, what is sequent repatterning? It brings together several established therapeutic techniques, and it allows for a journey, a sequence of interventions. Now, we know that misophonia doesn't enjoy enduring benefit through hypnotic suggestion for some time now. hypnosis has been used in a traditional suggestive way, and evidence of therapy does demonstrate the benefits, although they can seem to be quite marvellous in the short term, are transitory and are probably not consolidated as learned within the neurology of the individual. But employing hypnosis as a platform for therapy has a number of benefits. It provides an enhanced environment for psychological intervention and for neurological change. We bring in timeline aspects. We include parts work, ego states by any other name, and we use NLP, neuro-linguistic programming techniques, which include physical anchoring. We also sometimes use the swish technique. Now, a few moments ago, Tom mentioned using progressive muscle relaxation, what I sometimes refer to as being differential muscle relaxation, where the individual begins to learn the difference between relaxation and tension. And that, alongside physical anchoring, can bring about a state of calm, steady thought when anxiety has been the feeling up until that point. So this is something which is very important and is quite obviously part of the ongoing self-maintenance of any individual who is looking to reduce the effect of misophonia. So the underlying concept of sequent repatterning is perhaps that which is increasingly becoming known as neuropsychotherapy, or NPT. So this is the therapeutic framework. It begins on the left-hand side as you're looking at it and ends across on the right-hand side. And there are 5 broad areas of intervention as are shown on this slide. Now, misophonia usually shares an initial reflex across all these stimulus experiences. That is, some kind of physical jerk, the shrugging of the shoulders perhaps, or whatever it may be. But that will be the same whether the observed event is a cough heard or a swinging foot that's seen in the peripheral vision. So we begin at that end of the process usually, just allowing us to begin to achieve on a wider basis than we would do if we were working with each individual stimulus, or in the classical terminology, with each individual trigger. Now, I won't here go into the theoretical or the procedural detail of these steps, but I think it's probably important to notice that we begin by establishing a foundation for change, and as it says on the on the slide here, a firm and reliable foundation. We need to do a detailed assessment. Very often our clients arrive and they are very obviously self-diagnosed. Now, many of the clients that come to me for sequent repatterning have in fact seen Tom at the Misophonia Treatment Institute prior to contacting me. So very often they have been assessed to a certain extent and they have completed some kind of patient fact-finding documents. And amongst those, probably the key documents that we use are the MAQ2, the Misophonia Assessment Questionnaire, the second revision of that, and the A-MISO-S, which is the Amsterdam Misophonia Scale. We also endeavour to put together an inventory of the experiences that make them feel uncomfortable. That's called the trigger inventory. And we look at the physical and emotional severity of each of those and its source, both in terms of place or person. From there, we move on to introducing guided relaxation. Now, as I say, some of these clients will have experience with Tom and will have been introduced to progressive muscle relaxation. But we endeavour to go beyond simple physical relaxation here and begin to open the mind, if you like, to give the client an awareness of their inner world. And I do have a information sheet which I tend to give to the clients, which explains to them that their inner world is something that everyone shares and which is equally as important as the physical world around them. From there we move into the foundation and commitment, and the commitment also is essential here because the person being treated needs to know that they are responsible for their progress and that their therapist is there to guide them and not to do the work for them. We move on to a stage of emotional healing, as it's called here, which is really to identify the emotions that were associated with the initial condition, how they felt when they began to respond in an uncomfortable way to certain sounds, certain other experiences. It's quite important here for them to realise that they're not being in any way regressed, they're not being asked to revivify those experiences, but simply to reactivate those memories, because what we're looking to do is to bring those memories into a labile state later in the process. So around about this time that we also introduce physical anchors and give the client an opportunity to practice those in their own time. So these are self-guided activities. We'll then usually begin by doing some parts work on the ego states and looking at those behaviours and behaviour patterns that the individual has, and then we begin to look at reframing the reflex, and that's very much a context reframe that we do then. We can then move on and make some decisions there. Sometimes we do use the NLP swish technique, which is usually described as having a vision or a visualization of a better future, but also we'll do some anchoring of the positive resources that we're able to elicit. From there we move on to experiential reframing, and in this area I use a great deal of auditory hallucination, which seems to be especially effective because for those clients with sound sensitivities, we can ask them to hallucinate some of those sounds and to manipulate them both in terms of loudness, comfort levels, all kinds of parameters. We'll also look at some of the other contacts, and this is a fairly old slide, so it uses the T word, I'm afraid, in a number of areas, but we do look at those initiating responses. Usually by this time we've begun to see an improvement in the person's overall well-being, and also an improvement in how uncomfortable they become when they are exposed to an individual experience. That allows us then to begin to put together a plan for the future and to look and see their future self as somebody who is benefiting from the changes that have been achieved. So, what are those outcomes? It is very definitely not the case that every individual completes their own personal process within 8 sessions. Many of those that we see have other issues. Often there are multiple conditions that we're looking at, and as Randy mentioned earlier, there are those with conditions like OCD that we must take into account. Also, a significant proportion of the younger people that have worked with me have been somewhere on the autism spectrum as well. So we must balance how we provide interventions with need and with their actual progress, as well as other comorbidities. But the plan is to work to a program of 8 sessions and then to review at 8 or 10 weeks where we are. It is not a long-term therapy. So all that said, 2015 saw more individuals experiencing this therapy than previously, and that was made possible by having Mags Booth, Tara Economarkis and Desiree Verglers all commencing work with misophonia clients during that year. During 2015, I began and concluded sequences with 72 clients. That was working with individuals in the age range of 8 years old to a little over 70 years old. I'm not a specialist in working with children, and generally speaking, I prefer to work with individuals who are over 10 years old, but we did have some success with younger children. Now, only a few of these were face-to-face consultations in my therapy rooms. Generally, we consulted using the telemedicine platform VC, and that provides an uncomplicated and reliable connection, which in very many ways is far superior to Skype. But it really does seem that working remotely, online that is just as effective as being together in the same place and up close. Working online, we do need to ensure that the client's environment is appropriate, and those who maintain standards do best, it seems. So having comfortable, supportive seating, that's important. Good lighting, that's not too bright, but light enough for us to see what's going on. Using headphones or earbuds is very important. All those kinds of things that we would expect to have a reasonable quality call. But we also know, again from experience, that we benefit from frequent and regular sessions. And generally speaking, these are weekly. We try not to miss sessions. Certainly no more frequently than 5 days, and hopefully no less frequently than 10. But missed appointments and interruptions do genuinely ruin progress. So let's just move on and look at the achievements of those 72 individuals. Now, our intake process, as I think I mentioned a few moments ago, includes the consultation prior to commencement of therapy. And that's probably around about 45 minutes to an hour in length. And that may be, and usually is, I think, additional to some evaluation time with Tom, if they're, in many cases, referred through the Misophonia Treatment Institute. We also collect personal factual information together with standardised information gathering on the misophonia condition. And as I mentioned earlier, that very definitely includes A-Meso-S and MAQ2. Now, I used MAQ2 as a measure of severity and of progress during the therapeutic process. And I've been reluctant to modify it to create an MAQ3, if you like, because I think it will change its status as a standard. But perhaps that's a discussion for another time. I'd be interested to hear if there are any thoughts about that. But here on this slide, we see the MAQ scores immediately before we began therapy. That's before there's been any relaxation or any work at all. And the MAQ scores are grouped into buckets of 10. And as those of you who know the MAQ, the questionnaire runs from a score of 0 to a maximum of 63. And I think it's generally reckoned that the range from 31 represents severe, with those above 40 being really very severe. Between 11 and 20 is borderline, and certainly below 10 is subclinical by anybody's estimation. Now we can see the shift between the MAQ scores at intake and the scores at the conclusion of the structured program, which is usually planned for week 8. So this is those individuals as recorded at week 0, and this is their MAQ scores 2 months later. Now, as you can see, the distribution probably looks as though it has been mirrored. For the vast majority of individual clients, those values have fallen down into the subclinical or the non-severe areas. But rather than dwelling on these individual MAQ scores, let's just look at those scores when they've been normalised. So what we did was to normalise the MAQ scores to 100 at intake, and then to look at the percentage improvement over therapy. Now, as you'll see on the left-hand side, the green semi-transparent arrow pointing down towards 0, which is effectively 0 response on the MAQ and 0%. Let's just remove that now. But what we do see is that 2 individuals from this 72 actually reached an MAQ score of 0. Now that was one who had sequent repatterning alone, and one who'd had sequent repatterning that sufficiently reduced his emotional response to allow him to do some additional work on the physical reflex, and his MAQ reached 0. But we have a normalised MAQ here, normalised at 100% immediately before we commence the first therapy session, and then at the conclusion of the therapy sequence. I think this does better reflect the change per individual, although of course those beginning with a fairly low MAQ score have a consequently lower percentage change. But what we do see here is that at the 50 to 60% improvement, we have a large part of that population. Now, if we then move on to around about 6 months later, Now, please do be aware that this is a follow-up in a clinical setting. It's not the research or a trial. So we're really relying on the kind collaboration of individuals, and not all of them provided feedback at this stage. So the number of respondents here is slightly down on the previous slide. But what we do see quite clearly, that those recorded show that around about 75% of respondents still having a 50% or more reduction in their severity. That's in fact 44 out of 57. And that 35% of those responding after 6 months still had a 70% or better response to the therapy. And for those with a 70% improvement in their symptoms, for many of those it really has been life-changing. So I think it seems that we are justified in promoting this as an effective therapy. And we do also just need, I think, to take into account here all of the data that I've shown you shows that not a single individual had an increase in MAQ at any time following commencement of therapy, and that's in any case. So I think that's probably something which we ought to also congratulate ourselves upon, that we didn't have any that got worse while we were treating them. So maybe now just to have a look towards the future. And I think our future is centred very much around training. And ideally we must begin to expand our therapy provision, and we plan to train more therapists to effectively provide sequent repatterning. So having a wider clinical presence will also allow for further, and I hope wider, research and potential development. And it's also likely to bring a still more eclectic mix of therapists into the sequent repatterning area. Our plans now include training a cohort of experienced and qualified therapists. And to do that, as I did in 2015, when we were working face to face, but we can quite obviously work online, especially now that Tom has brought WizIQ into our focus. Training might, as I mentioned, be physical or virtual, and I think it might include training groups, larger groups as well as small, as well as one-to-one training. And we look at the kinds of training candidates that are suitable in a few moments, but just for now saying suitable, qualified and experienced therapists. And I would hope also those with an active practice. Now I noticed that working with those for whom English isn't a first language, that influenced our progress, and my own attempts at integrating German into therapy created a lot of moments of hilarity, but I don't think they did very much to promote therapeutic excellence. But I was fortunate enough to be able to train Desiree Verglers last year, and she's from the Netherlands. She's a native Dutch speaker with faultless German, and although she's been unwell over these past few months, I'm hoping that she'll be able to return to practice fairly soon. And it's clear that working in a native tongue is not simply a benefit, but in most cases it is essential. So extending sequent repatterning into Spanish, French, German, Chinese variants and others must really now be a priority for us all. So, who is it that might be suitable for training. Now, I mentioned earlier, I think that adopting these techniques, the sequence of repatterning interventions, should be for practicing therapists. That's individuals working with clients or patients in an effective way already. And with, first of all, skills and abilities, but also formal or qualified training under their belt in specific therapeutic techniques, and that includes hypnosis, yes, qualified, I'd say to hypnotherapy diploma or practitioner diploma level in the UK, and accepted for registration here by the CNHC, the Government Created Professional Standards Authority. And in the USA, I think that is broadly equivalent to a board certified hypnotist practitioner. In NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, perhaps a diploma validated by one of the recognised bodies like DIP NLP. Timeline work and parts therapy are possibly less well defined or regulated, but certainly recognised courses accredited by the Guild of Hypnotists in the USA, the GHR or NCH in the UK, or by the National Council for Physiotherapists or the British Psychological Society. For those in the UK, perhaps from a psychology background rather than from a hypnotherapy background. But, and importantly, the candidate for training should be somebody with a busy and dynamic practice and day-to-day client contact. This isn't something that can be read from a book. It needs to be intuitively delivered. And an interview, I guess, or a discussion with each potential training delegate may well clarify their suitability before we sign them up. So what else in the future? I think as my time is coming to a close, I very much like to see a formal register of therapists who are using and able to use sequent repatterning as a therapy, and this is something that Tom has begun to do through the Misophonia Institute. I think that we need close ties to the Misophonia Treatment Institute and to the Misophonia Institute itself. I think there should be a community of therapists, and not just sequent repatterning therapists, but very certainly a group like this collaboration group where we can get together, we can exchange ideas, and we can learn from one another. So there should be a community of therapists. And again, in all areas, a continual development, I think, would be very useful. But quite obviously, in sequent repatterning, I am looking to continue to develop the techniques that we're using. So that brings me to the empty slide and then to the thank you. You can find out more about sequent repatterning. You can contact me. There's a contact form on my website, www.chrispearson.co.uk. There's also a contact form at www.sequentrepatterning.com. And that concludes my rather whistle-stop tour through sequent repatterning. And I just heard Tom return to the host seat. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Chris. Questions, everyone? What questions, comment, discussion? What do you have for Chris? So I see Esther is typing. Can you say more about the reflexive part, Chris?
What brought Tom and I into contact, I think, was the recognition that there is a physical reflex involved in misophonia. I would say in all cases, but I'll moderate that to say most. I was very early on confronted with a client who came to see me who reacted very badly to the sound of whispering. And when she was exposed to whispering, she would the muscular response straightened all of her fingers and thumbs, and she'd drop anything that she was holding. And I found that quite astonishing. I investigated it, and that was what began to lead me to believe that the physical reflex in misophonia is an important step in the process. And I also quite firmly believe that if that physical reflex can be removed or it can be subdued, that it actually reduces the emotional response that comes after it.
Okay, so let me show something here. So Chris, do you see a video screen on your window now of a girl of a foot?
I see a media player, but I don't see a picture.
Okay, so this is I believe a 9-year-old girl who I videoed the physical reflex of.
An 8-year-old girl with misophonia, and it's a demonstration of the reflex she had on October 21st. And you'll notice that her shoulder jerks and that her foot jerks when she hears the sniffing sound.
Do you hear that? See that?
I can hear the audio, but I
with
can't see the
misophonia,
video.
and this is a demonstration of the
So then
reflex
we
that she
have to-
had
how on earth
on
do I-
October the 21st.
Okay, so
And you'll
this
notice
is
that her shoulder jerks
frustrating for me
and that
that
her
I've
foot jerks when
not
she
been able
hears the
to show this.
It's asking for a YouTube URL.
with misophonia, and this is a demonstration
Well,
of the reflex
I
that she
actually
had on
have given it the YouTube URL and thought that this would in fact show it to everyone, but clearly you're not seeing it.
I'm not, although Michael has said he is seeing it.
So Esther said she can see the video. Okay, so I have to clear my throat here, and I'm going to mute my microphone. I thought I had it muted right when I cut it back on before, and I cleared my throat. So to those with misophonia who watch this later, I apologize. But this is going to have a strong sniff in it. I'm going to play it again. And so the first part will show her shoulder and her whole upper
with
body
misophonia,
jerk. And this
this is a
is,
demonstration of the reflex that she had
watch
on
this. So,
October.
so did you see that jerk, that her whole upper body kind of jerks, and I could see her arm jerk. And I thought that's where her reflex was. But upon working with her more, I noticed that her reflex was actually in her leg.
With misophonia,
And so we're going to
this is a
see
demonstration
now
of the
what it
reflex that she
shoots to
had
her.
on
Shows us the image
October
of
the
her leg.
21st. And you'll notice that her shoulder jerks and that her foot jerks when she hears the sniffing sound.
And notice how the toes open up and the feet kind of kick out. And when we worked on this a little bit last year, she reported that she feels it in her calves. So obviously that's where her real initial reflex
With
is. Here it goes again.
misophonia, this is an 8-year-old girl with misophonia, and this is a demonstration of the reflex that she had.
Well, I don't know
on
why that just cut
October.
back, because it's supposed to be. Here it goes.
Relaxed.
And so there is a physical jerk of that muscle in her legs. And it looks like that reflex is a conditioned physical reflex response to the trigger stimulus. And I've seen that in a number of individuals, in almost all individuals. Esther, I worked with one woman on a intermittent basis, fairly continual, steady at first, and she could not identify her physical reflex. We didn't know that she had one. 6 months into working together, she declared one day, "I know what my physical reflex is." And she told me that when she was at work that week, one of her coworkers said, "Why are you angry?" And she says, "I'm not angry." And the lady said, "Then why are you frowning?" She had said, "And in fact, you frown almost all the time." And she realized that her physical response was a frown. And so she actually found that when she's triggered, if she rubs up in her eyebrows, in this area, that it really helps to reduce the stress and the agony of her misophonia, because it's pinching. She's essentially getting a bee sting in her forehead. So that's the video, or that's the initial reflex. Does that answer your question, Esther?
Could you, Tom, paste the YouTube URL into the chat box, and then we can see what that is? And for those of us that couldn't see it, maybe we can watch it on YouTube later.
Okay, that would be a very doable thing. So here it is. There's the URL.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody, it worked for somebody. There was a hand that went up. Esther, let's see if we can give you the microphone. You have to accept it, Esther. There's something on your end, a box that's going to come up and say, "Please, will you allow WizIQ to control your computer," or something like that. We had trouble with this a couple of months ago with an individual not being able to find the right controls on your end. So Esther, I apologize. I don't know where they are. Oh, she's got it. Esther, welcome. Perfectly.
Oh, okay. So does this reflex occur when there's the initial stimulus, or does it continue? Does it come and go?
My interpretation of it is that it is an instant and a response to the sensory experience. So it is, to all intents and purposes, the very first conscious awareness that the person has of their response.
It actually, I agree with Chris, it makes an auditory sound a physical sensation. And
oh, that's a multi-sensory.
Well,
I'd say it makes the sensory experience into a physical movement, but Tom is...
No, I like that. That's exactly, Chris, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Is that when my autonomic nervous system hears a trigger, a physical motion is, a muscle reflex is elicited in my body. So I feel it as a jerk to my body. Essentially, it's kind of, like getting shocked by static electricity. And it can actually be very, very strong in some individuals, and it can be very weak in others. But it seems that that physical sensation is always there.
And then when you do progressive muscle relaxation, do you try to differentially target?
Yes,
those areas?
absolutely. Especially if it is an area that is easily affected. Shoulders, fist clench, jaw clench. There are some areas that muscle relaxation cannot help us with this initial reflex. For example, a stomach constriction or an intestinal constriction, sexual response. Yeah. Those are I have cases of those also, but the muscle relaxation wouldn't work for that. But if a person can relax, if suppose a person that had the fist clench open, hands go open, that if that person can work at relaxing those muscles, then it can have a large impact in the severity of their misophonia.
I'd also add here, Tom, that although quite obviously there are areas which we cannot involve in therapeutic work, for instance, the stomach, we can use hypnotic techniques to manipulate the muscles in the stomach wall, and I do for those with a stomach response. Some of the other smooth muscle in the intestines that we can begin to influence, although we can do it, they can't actually feel that, and if they can't feel it, it's probably not a worthwhile exercise. But there are internal muscles that can be manipulated through hypnotic techniques.
Which is fantastic, because progressive muscle relaxation cannot, right? That muscle.
But the benefit there, of course, is that once the individual has learned that is possible, they can allow that to happen. They can incorporate that into their routine. But that's a small point. Sorry, Esther, I think I interrupted you.
Well, maybe I interrupted you, but so I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, and I'm not sure if this would in any way parallel tics, but what you sometimes try to do is help the person identify a key sensation to the tic, and then if they can, when they notice that, do the opposite of that sensation or movement, that's a bit helpful. But I don't know if the reflex reaction is really quite the same as a tic.
You're a little bit, volume's a little bit low, Esther. I think you were saying that sometimes you help people identify a sensation that they're having and then try to come up with an opposite one. Was that correct?
Yes, when working with tics.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not sure if this reflex may be a different thing than a tic, but when you were describing that, it reminded me a little bit of that, doing an opposite reaction to the sensation that comes just before the tic. But I don't know if that would apply to a reflex.
I think it is very, very similar, Esther, in some ways. I've looked at some of the work that's been done by Linda Hudson on tics using hypnosis. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. And I find a lot of parallels there. I guess the way I'm looking at this is to use the kind of triune brain model rather than a physical mapping, and most of that processing which occurs in the pre-mammalian parts of the brain, that physical reflex occurs at the moment that the message moves into the neocortex, into the conscious awareness.
Like very fast.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I believe, one reason that with misophonia, exposure, traditional, well, maybe not exposure, but not graduated exposure or desensitization, but just exposure to the triggers tends to make it stronger, makes misophonia worse, and probably the reflex stronger. That with a phobia, you have a physiological response that comes up and up and up, and if you're continue being exposed to that picture of the spider, then that sensation starts to come, physiological response comes down. Where with misophonia, you hear the sniff and it's this instant response. It's an instant physical jerk. And it's not about allowing it to come down over time, because classical conditioning occurs between a stimulus and a response within muscular, within a half to 0 to maybe maximum of 2 seconds. And so it's an instant conditioning effect experience where I get let's say a 50% jerk in the muscle because of the trigger sound, and then I get another 25% adder on that because I'm upset. And so I'm creating really a classical conditioning event that strengthens this physical reflex. But the other thing I want to mention before we're out of time real quick is the emotional response. Bender Kumar gave a presentation at the Misophonia conference, and we hope to have him on this once he's published the article. But where the emotional response appears to also be a conditioned response, a conditioned emotional response. So we're dealing with two levels of conditioned responses. One is the physical one, and one is the emotional one. Comments, thoughts?
Well, it's just those are conditioned response to the stimulus and or to sensitivity. Like, where does the hypersensitivity, or is that not quite a correct concept?
I believe that the hypersensitivity, I thought, or the sibling who thumps their brother in the ear every time they pass. One thump is one thing, but when they do it day in, day out, the emotional buildup can become extreme. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I have to think about it, but I understand what.
Because there's lots of pairings. See, if let's look at fingernails on a chalkboard. Fingernails on a chalkboard. I hear the screech. I shiver. I have a physical response, and I go, "Stop that! I hate that!" And so the sensation is uncomfortable. It's irritating. It's intrusive, and there are many, many pairings of the, irritating, anger, disgust, whatever the emotions are, with that sound and with that sensation. So the emotional response comes to a point that they've had so many pairings of this sensation and this irritation that now the irritation becomes an irritation reflex, a conditioned emotional response.
Yeah, I see how if you're talking about conditioned reflex, that seems like an opposite kind of process in exposure conceptualization.
Say that again a little bit louder. I'm not sure I understand.
I have to think about it more, but I can see if it's a conditioned response, the more you do it, the stronger it gets, as opposed to the concept of exposure, where the more you do it, the weaker it gets.
Right, and that is, and at least in the natural environment, that is what we see, is that the more they're exposed to trigger stimuli, the worse their misophonia becomes. Okay, well, let me run over here real quickly for those of us who are still here. Chris, thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to say both thank to Randy and Chris. And here's the future workshops. I'm not going to cover those now. That's in the PowerPoint. But let's see, I'm hitting more thank yous. Stop the recording because now I'm going to